All right, so today I wanted to give you an example how you might do a curtain pull using the class system and the nodes within that class system.
Are you recording?
Yep, I'm gonna record this. In fact, I'm recording, saying that I'm recording the fact that I'm saying that I'm recording this. So you'll enjoy that later. Anyway, so to begin with, because this is going to be a class simulation, I'm just going to start with a big piece of cloth. And because it's a simulation, it requires some attention to scale. If you imagine trying to fold a millimeter slice of leather, big thick leather, it's not going to fold real easy because it's so small. But if it was, you had a piece of leather that was 10 feet wide, that would be very easy to fold. Because the thickness related to its length is different. So we need to compensate for that for the class system. So all you have to do is make sure that your units are set up to something reasonable. So I'm going to go to unit setup, and I like setting up my system units to be inches. I don't usually work at a scale smaller than an inch, so that's pretty good. And just make sure that you're in the same unit family. If you're using millimeters, use the metric system. If you're using inches like I am, you might want to use feet with inches or just inches. I hate fractions, so I use decimal inches. Use whatever you're comfortable with. Whatever your sense of scale works better in is fine, as long as you're paying attention to scale. For Garment Maker, which is what I'm going to use to triangulate my mesh, it requires a spline object to work with. So I'm just going to use a rectangle. I'm going to go through this lesson assuming you have some experience with the software. You want to do all your pieces for anytime you're using Garment Maker in the top view. I'm not sure if it's going to matter for this particular project, but it's a good habit to get into, especially if you're going to use Garment Maker to assemble any sort of actual garments, clothing. They need to be created in the top view, if I remember right. So it's a good habit to get into for all your objects, actually, because then it orients up in the z-axis.
Okay. I was just picturing drapes.
And they will, actually. I'm going to lift this and reorient it after it's created. But the habit I take is we create everything in the top view unless there's a reason to otherwise. That way the z-axis is up. Okay, so once I have this rectangular spline laid out, and I should also mention it doesn't have to be rectangular, it could be a specific shape. You can draw any spline shape and this will work. And you might experiment with that, actually. So I'm going to come down here into the length and width to make sure that it's a reasonable scale. A 14-foot by 22-foot curtain isn't too unreasonable, so I'll just go ahead and leave those values alone. In the Modify tab, I'm going to change the object from a rectangle by right-clicking on that layer to an editable spline. I'm doing that because unless I do this next step, the corners tend to get cut off depending on the triangulation. This ensures that we have nice sharp corners. And that step is to break all the corners so that we have 4 segments in the spline instead of one continuous spline. To do that, you just select all the corners, or Control A works as well. And then doing a break command. You can access the break command from the right-click menu, break vertices, or you can go into the parameters for your editable spline. There's a break command here too. Okay, so now instead of one giant continuous spline, I actually have 4 segments. And I can select them and move them off to the side if I wanted to. But I'm not. I just want to demonstrate what that break does. It breaks one continuous spline into 4 separate splines in this case. Okay, so that prepares it for the next modifier that I'm going to use, and that's called Garment Maker. So I'm going to exit out of subobjects mode, and then from the modifier list, choose Garment Maker. Hit G on the keyboard, it'll jump right to it. It's the only G modifier in the list. Now, I don't know if it's still true or not, in this version of the software. I don't know if it was a bug or what, but it used to be, and I'm not brave enough to test this, maybe you are. If you didn't uncheck this preserve toggle before you change the density, it used to lock up the software pretty good. So I'm going to uncheck preserve, and then if we look here at this triangulation, we can increase the density if we want by upping the density number. So if you're not getting really good, nice folds, you might want to come back and play with this number. I'm going to leave it pretty coarse or not very dense, just so that the simulation runs a little bit easier, a little bit faster. And then if I need it smoother later, I can always come back and change that. But for now, I'm just going to leave it at maybe 0.1. The actual value isn't important. It's the density of this triangulation that occurs. This is what you should look for. Imagine this is a crumpled piece of paper. A crumpled piece of paper drapes over things, folds more organically than a grid structure. So that's why we do this step. It'll make the cloth fold a little bit more naturally. Okay, that's all the garment maker is for, is that triangulation. Once that's in place, then I can go ahead and reposition this if necessary. So I'm going to go ahead and lift this up off the floor, rotate it at a nice even 90-degree angle. Be mindful that it does have a front and back surface, so if you're looking at this from the wrong direction, you'll see right through it. We'll fix that later too. But for now, just want to make sure that it's facing you. Maybe do a quick test render to make sure that it is facing you. I'm going to lift it a little bit off of the floor. When we run the simulation, it'll actually drape or drop just a hair depending on the tension of the fabric. And then I also probably want to include an actual floor as well. So for that, I'm just going to use a regular plane object. And this will give the curtain something to hit on the. It'll kind of bunch up on the ground if it hits the floor. Then it doesn't just dangle loosely, unless you want that effect. Okay. So now what I'm going to do is, before I actually run a simulation here, is set up my curtain rings, or the nulls that will actually pull the curtain left and right. And these can be arranged in any manner that you want. If you want a kind of a rope pull at the middle of the curtain, so it bunches up in the middle first before pulling to the left or right, you can do all kinds of things depending on your placement of these nulls. So the next step here is to go into the Create tab, and I'm going to go into my Helpers category. And you can use dummies, you can use point helpers, either or is fine. I'm going to use points. Anything that doesn't render is fine. If you want to use geometry, that's fine too, I think, if I remember right. If nothing else, you can parent a null to your geometry and do the same thing. But what I'm going to do here is set up a point at each location where I want a portion of the curtain to bunch up. So I'm going to start on the left or right, depending on where I want this anchored. So if I want this to draw left, I'll start on the left. So I'm going to just make one point here just above the curtain. And then either equidistantly across or randomly, I can create several more. But what I want to do before I do that is actually set up some animation for this first. Actually, let me do it to the second one, because the first one's going to stay put. This is going to be my anchor point, basically. So I'm going to hold Shift and make one additional anchor point. And I'm going to make it a copy. And this is the one I'm going to apply some animation to. Real simple animation, just 2 keyframes. I'll turn on auto key, go to the end of the 100 frames here, or whatever length you'd like. And I'm going to move it over to where I want it to bunch up at. So maybe I'll push it over here to the little bit closer to the other one. So it's not going to move very far. It's going to move from this point over to the left. Now that I have this single point animated, as I copy it, it will keep these keyframes, and I can just adjust the two keyframes. So if I hold Shift now and pull this one a little bit over to the left or to the right, I can make a copy. So now that I've copied this point here, one little hiccup is that it also copied the complete animation, including the last keyframe, where it ends up at the same point as the previous one. All I need to do is go to the last keyframe, and as long as auto key is still on, it'll just change that last keyframe to the new position. So if you don't want them to bunch up all in the same location, I'd recommend moving them so that they're a little bit spaced out. Otherwise the cloth might pull in and intersect itself, which looks a little unnatural. I'm going to play with the spacing on all of these a little bit. There we go. I like that a little bit better. But they should all now pull back to a different spacing. So now they start off a little bit wider and they come together a little bit. I can repeat that process until I get to the end of the curtain here by shift dragging at frame 0 to the new position.